Good afternoon. My name is Kenny Alexander. I'd like to introduce you to my um, cohort debate person today, Sarah Garcia, and we are debating our ethical frameworks for Social Work 602. I'd like to start off by saying for my framework, I've chosen the Steinman, Richardson, and McEnroe ethical decision-making process as my framework. In this framework, once the problem has been identified, the social worker can follow the steps of the framework to determine the best ethical decision. I'll use an example of a therapist whose patient has asked them to play on their softball team. In step one of the framework, we identify the ethical standard that's involved. First, we refer to the NASW Code of Ethics. In the NASW Code of Ethics Standards Section 1.06, it's entitled Conflict of Interest. It states that the social worker should not be involved in dual relationships with a client or former client that could cause risk to the client. It's the responsibility of the social worker to set those boundaries. Over Zur, PhD of the Zur Institute, classifies playing in the same sports league a situation in which a therapist would be crossing both a boundary and setting up a dual relationship. In step two of the framework, we determine if there's an ethical trap possibility. The therapist might say, just doing it just this one time is not going to hurt anything. It seems innocuous to play a game together, but the therapist could be endangering their license if they were to possibly drink too much of the game and reveal information about the patient, or the patient themselves could also reveal information about what's going on with the therapist, setting up judgment from the other players. In step three of the framework, we frame the preliminary response to the patient. It's possible to honor the invitation of the patient with thanks and praise for their own ability and play softball and to continue on working with the patient. The therapist needs to outline that playing on the same team or an opposing team could lead to a very awkward situation that could affect their professional relationship. In step four, we must consider the consequences. The attitudes and feelings that develop on the softball field, such as fairness, talent, and favoritism, could also spill over into the therapy room and cloud the judgment of both the therapist and the patient and inhibit the healing of the patient. The therapist could accidentally disclose information that could be harmful to the patient during a game. In step five, we prepare an ethical resolution. It's possible to explain to the patient that the law is very clear about the boundaries and the relationship between the patient and the therapist, and thus placing the weight of the situation on the law and not on the therapist. In step six, we get feedback. That feedback comes from discussing the situation with your supervisor or a peer or a legal advisor that can help resolve the issue and allow the social worker to discuss their own personal values at this time before making a decision. And in the final step, we take action. At this point, we tell the patient what the law and the agency's stance is, and we consider discussing boundaries and dual relationships during the initial intake session in the future. Now, working within this framework considers both the NASW code, the value of the therapist, and the feelings and mental health of the patient. The essential steps and ethical problem-solving framework selected by my colleague does not take into consideration the possibility of this ethical trap. According to Jack Schaefer, an ethical trap consists of two ethical decisions in which the therapist makes a poor primary decision that in turn leads to the need to make a second ethical decision. Schaefer goes on to state that research suggests that everyone confronted with an ethical decision does not do as much as they should. And the Steinman, Richardson, and McEnroe ethical decision-making framework guides the social worker and keeps them from skating on thin ice. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sarah with her rebuttal.
Hello, thank you. The framework that I decided to go with was the Kramer and Conrad's essential steps for ethical problem solving. The specific framework is to determine if there is a ethical issue. Then identify and rank the values and principles related to the ethical standards regarding the ethical issue. Develop and implement a plan of action and seek assistance if needed. And reflect on the outcome to determine if the care of the client is in ethical standing. Sorry. The ethical dilemma that I will use as an example is patients on hospice care being able to self-determinate. The scenario is that I have a client who lives alone needing assistance in their acts of daily living. They are no longer to keep up with house cleaning, laundry, bathing, and feeding themselves appropriate meals. The family has requested the help of a social worker to find adequate placement for the client. The client is alert and oriented and refuses to leave his home. He feels that he can take care of himself even though he is aware of his declining state. Step one is to determine the ethical issues that could arise as a social worker because the patient is in an unsafe living situation, but also the client can make his wishes and choices known, and he does not want to leave his home. And the social worker cannot force him out of his home. Step two is to identify the NASW standards to be addressed with communicating with the clients. The standards addressed would be self-determination and informed consent. Social workers are committed to the care of the clients and we want what's best for them. The client can self-determinate for himself, but he is not thinking on his health and safety. He's putting his own wants above that. The next step would be ranking the standards used. It would be the commitment to the clients and putting their needs and wants first. Self-determination, listening and respecting the client's choices, but acting when necessary. Excuse me. Informed consent would be the other last ranking of that. Giving the client the information so that he understands and is able to make informed choices regarding his care. The next step would be to develop a plan of action. The social worker will receive the client's consent to reach out to the patient's to his family and set up a family meeting. This way, the patient can make his opinions and choices heard, and the patient can listen to the concerns of the family as well as the social worker. The social worker will give options like different facilities that would suit his needs or home care workers that can help the patient with his acts of daily living. The next step would be to implement. With active listening and being empathetic to the client's wishes, as a group, we can develop a plan that will be beneficial to the client and his family. For example, suppose the clients and the client's family are agreeable to having home health care instead of a facility. We can see if we can give him some time frame to see how the patient does in his home with the caregivers. And that way the client can determine if he wants to continue with home health caregiving or possibly move into a facility if he feels like it's not working that way. Step 6 is, Step 6 is to reflect. Reflection is a skill that social workers obtain through learned practices in dealing with clients. For example, the family meeting and the decisions have been made. It is essential to reflect on the situation, the outcome, and the potential next move. Reflecting helps the social workers gain insight on how to help clients, future clients, if they are going through similar situations. Why I think this model is to be considered, why I think this model is a little bit different and I like it a little better than the model 4 is because while model 3 does not consider the ethical trap, the ethical decision-making process model does not rank the social work ethical values used to help guide the care of the clients. Ranking the ethical values helps the social worker understand why it's important to the client, what is important to the plans, I should say. It is also important to point out that the ethical decision-making process model does not implement a plan. By implementing a plan, the social worker is going into the situation to understand that different situations can play out. Still, with the essential steps for ethical problem solving model, the social worker has already thought of the many different situations and is ready for an outcome is presented. That is the end of our debate. Sorry for my stammering. But thank you guys, and thanks, Kenny.
Thank you very much.